Amanda Todd was an innocent 15-year-old girl in Midwestern America. Unfortunately, one day she had the misfortune of having a sexual predator solicit nude pictures from her and post them on the internet. Instead of receiving the support that she needed from her classmates, she was constantly demonized with hate speech on the internet. They called her horrible names like whore and bitch, and they even said that she didn't deserve to live because she was an inferior woman. This is the reality of hate speech on social media. And because we believe that people like Amanda Todd should never suffer like this, we are proud to propose this motion and believe that hate speech is not free speech. Because at the end of the day, Amanda Todd drank bleach and killed herself. I'll be doing 3 things in this speech. Firstly, going over some definitions. Second, outlining the framing. And third, laying out our first 2 substantive arguments. That first, hate speech harms innocent people, and secondly, hate speech silences minority voices. My second speaker will go into our third argument, that hate speech, even when unintended, is still bad. But first, some definitions. Firstly, we define social media as online platforms of mass communication. This includes things like Facebook and Twitter and Reddit and 4chan. This is fairly self-explanatory. Second, we define hate speech as speech or posts online that silence, intimidate, demonize, and oppress an individual or group. Finally, we define repeatedly as 3 or more times. We think this is fairly arbitrary, but a 3 strikes policy is something that's universal in the world today. Next, let's move on to some framing questions in today's round. We believe this is a value motion today. We're not debating an actual policy implication of banning hate speech online. As the word believe in the resolution implies, we're simply defending the harms or benefits of doing this. Secondly, we would also say that because this occurs in limited context in the world today, we're not actually taking any policy action. Next, we would say that the primary clash in this round is between the individual rights and societal good. What side opposition has to show you today is that the right of an individual to express their voices online, even if it's a bad thing, outweighs the societal harm that comes from hate speech. No thanks. We would say that in any case, hate speech is a bad thing. We limit rights all the time. We say that in Germany, they ban pictures of swastikas because they've been culturally bad icons. In the United States and the UK, you can't yell things like fire in a crowded theater because although that violates your right to free speech, it gives a proportional benefit to society that outweighs that violation. Finally, we would have one more point of clarification. People lose jobs in the world today because of things they post online. If you post something really horrible, some really terrible hate speech on the internet, that's a grounds for you to lose your job. We think it's only natural to also have people lose their social media accounts in these situations because these are such horrible violations. And that's what we're going to prove to you today. This is the bottom line in today's case. The harm to individuals is huge because of hate speech, but the perceived benefit that people gain from actually being able to say these horrible things is minimal, and that's what side opposition needs to defend. Let's move on to our first substantive argument, that hate speech harms innocent people. 2 layers of analysis. Firstly, people who are identified online. Remember the example of Amanda Todd, but know that this isn't an isolated incident. A study found that in the United States, high school students, I'll take you in 1 second, are 80% more likely to target people for hate speech if it's online. This is because of the depersonalized aspect of the internet that makes this all the more prevalent. Sure.
If Amanda Todd was attacked by such a cruel offender, wouldn't the offender have created just new accounts to offend her more?
Firstly, we would say that she was attacked by all of her classmates at her school. And secondly, even if these offenders are creating new accounts, we think it's the right thing to do to ban the first account. This is something that we believe the House should do, as implied in the motion. On to my point. 33% of adolescents who are bullied online will kill themselves. This has been empirically proven, and it's a horrible study. We think that we should mitigate this hate speech as much as possible, and the way to go about this is by banning hate speech on social media. Let's go on to Facebook. Facebook has shown many examples of this in the past. Look to domestic terrorist Dylan Roof in the United States. He killed 14 people in a church in South Carolina. After an investigation of his Facebook, they found out that he was posting images of things like the Confederate flag, like hate speech against black people. And he was even trying to incite what he called a race war to get more people to buy into his cause. Even after he was taken by the police, many other people took to the internet and posted things like black people deserve to die, like what Dylan Roof said is correct. Like this hate speech should be actualized in the real world, and we think that's a horrible thing that we mitigate on side proposition.
In many southern states in the US, people hate gays. Can I hold my boyfriend's hand in Iowa because people are really offended by this?
This has nothing to do with emotion. What we say is that if people hate gay people in some regions of the world, they should not be able to demonize them online because that leads to horrible effects. Their point is irrelevant. Next, let's look at Twitter. After the Paris attacks recently, we saw anti-refugee sentiment and anti-Muslim sentiment skyrocket on Twitter. What this means is that there was a huge uptick also in discrimination in Paris. People lost jobs because they were Muslims. People were discriminated against and demonized in the real world because they were refugees. This was horrible implications that came from social media. And one thing that we should clarify right now is that the primary means by which we receive information in the world today is social media. It's no longer the world of print newspaper. It's no longer the world of watching the television. It's social media. So when this primary marketplace of ideas is corrupted so much, the implications are magnified greatly. Second layer of analysis, anonymity. Look to websites like Reddit and 4chan. These social media sites allow people to post completely anonymously, without their names being there. And this exacerbates the horrible effects even more. We would say that when a Reddit page is titled something like rape jokes or Holocaust jokes, or when we have subreddits based on actual sexual harassment and demonizing those groups, those are horrible things. What this means is that in anonymous context, this hate speech is dominating the kind of free speech that's on the internet. It's putting out ideas that are particularly horrible. And when we see these ideas transitioning into the real world, because social media is the primary form of media in the world today, we think that's a horrible thing. Even on 4chan today, there are pages about 9/11 memes or jokes about the terrorist attacks that occurred in the US. And this only leads to an uptick in anti-Muslim sentiment that hurts good, innocent individual people. That's what we're opposing in today's motion. Second argument to today's debate, how minority voices are silenced. We already told you about the individual effect of today's debate. We already demonstrated to you how individual people like Amanda Todd, like Muslims in Paris, and like others around the world are demonized by this hate speech. But this also occurs on a societal level. We say throughout history, all societies have a history of systemically oppressing marginalized groups. We see this in the United States with racism, in South Africa with apartheid, in India with the Assamese, and the list goes on and on and on. But the difference is today, hate speech online further silences these groups, because now you have a group of people who are historically been more powerful, who are demonizing a lesser group of people online. We say this is particularly bad when Stanford University reports that Twitter is more segregated than the real world. We say, when we look on a whole to the societal trends that come off these online websites, it has a couple of impacts. Firstly, marginalized people can't participate in social media. This is very apparent. If marginalized people like Muslims are constantly being told on Facebook that they are less than their counterparts, they're not going to participate in this media, they're not going to put their ideas out in the free marketplace of ideas. This reduces their inclusion in the most important form of media in the world today and increases their oppression because now these people who are oppressing them are just in an echo chamber. They're just talking to each other and these views are getting more and more extreme. Because we believe that hate speech is not free speech, and that no one should die because someone online says something inappropriate. We are proud to oppose and beg you to do the same.
There's a quite popular quote in, sorry. There's a quite popular quote in the US that says, "I may not agree with what you are saying, but I will die for your right to say it." With these words, I would like to welcome you to this debate from Team Opposition. In order to win this debate, Team Proposition has to prove that hate speech has such a significant impact that, that people must be protected from this, and that a ban is the right way to do this, and the most effective way to do this. We, as Team Opposition, need to show you that, first of all, their policy is not legitimate due to the freedom of speech, and that their policy actually worsens what is already happening. Now, as the speaker correctly pointed out, it is not a policy debate. However, if we are talking about something like this, we do need to consider the implications of what would happen if we looked at this. And secondly, we have to talk somehow how it works and how this banning actually improves the situation that they were talking about, which is something that they completely neglected. Now, let me come to the rebuttal. First of all, they painted this big picture of this horrible situation on the social media. Now, we as Team Opposition do see this problem as well. This problem does exist. However, we see two problems in the way that they are attempting to change this. First of all, we see that banning people from social media is a completely ineffective way to do this because people are so anonymous in the internet that they can just make a new account and continue with this. We do not see how this would actually help the situation and help all these suffering people. No, thank you. Furthermore, we see this big point of freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is simply more important in this case as something that cannot be impeded on. In a pluralistic society in which we have discussion, in which there are a lot of different opinions, discussion is necessary. And ladies and gentlemen, this also means that people are able to voice opinions which may be bad, opinions of political minorities, because a pluralistic democratic society has to be able to endure if somebody says something that is bad, no thank you, and then contradict them, open a discussion, and say why we need to deal with this issue. And these issues can only be dealt with on a bigger level. No thank you. Now, in our team line, to actually show that we fulfill this burden, we have divided our arguments up as follows. I will talk about the significance of freedom of speech, and our second speaker will show you how their policy and their idea actually worsens the situation that we already have today. This aligns directly with our burden, and by doing so, we show that team proposition does not fulfill theirs. Now, when we are talking about the freedom of speech, we are in this case talking about the freedom of speech in social media. Now, we need to first establish this link, how freedom of speech also applies to social media. Now, social media in today's world has a massive influence. Since the founding of Facebook, which is currently the biggest social media, there are more than 1 billion people on this social media. These are so many people, and this is so relevant that this is something that we definitely have to look at when we are talking about freedom of speech. No, thank you. In fact, there are so many people on social media that social media has become an extension of the real world. So, in the old times, people met on a market square to voice their opinions and show their views. However, nowadays, ladies and gentlemen, this happens mostly on social media. No, thank you. And thus, the same rights must apply to social media as well. Now, why is freedom of speech so important? Why is this something that is so relevant and cannot be limited or censored both in the real world and on social media? Now, we see two main reasons for this. First of all, the relevance of freedom of speech for the individual, and then the relevance of freedom of speech in a democratic, pluralistic society. Yes, please.
So you're saying the rights of an internet troll to spew racial sentiments is more important than protecting the actual lives of historically marginalized people?
I got your point. Well, we do see that there is a problem that many people are voicing bad opinions. However, we do also see that in an open society, this has to be able to be endured. We do have to have a society that is stable enough, that is strong enough to deal with these people. No, thank you, I'm just answering. And show that also that there are people that have bad opinions, but there are also many people that are against this and can say, well, we see this point and it's irrelevant because. Now this discussion doesn't even happen if we just ban these people. And what happens, no thank you, is that people are marginalized, which is something that my second speaker will elaborate further, and these people will actually put into a situation where they will still have their opinions. These opinions just won't disappear, and they'll actually go somewhere else and find their group of people. These opinions will happen, but it'll be in a marginalized way, in a way that is maybe even due to the frustration that they're actually banned from the social media. No, thank you. Be even worse and have more real-life consequences. So indeed, we do see that it's better to have a discussion than just ban it and pretend that it doesn't exist. Now, if we look at the rights of the individual concerning human rights, which was my point, we see that this freedom of speech is one of the most fundamental rights that we have, and a right that is an achievement of mankind, which we have worked very, very long for. Now, this right is somewhat sacred and should not be infringed on, because the definition, once you start censoring something, no thank you, and once you start saying, well, there is this, but we have limits, it's very hard to stop. No thank you. And this is a road that we don't even want to go down, because if we're talking, in this case, we're talking about hate speech. Now, hate speech, no thank you, is a very slippery term. They did define it correctly, however, it's so nuanced and it can be interpreted in so many different ways that the limits are very hard to set. And this is simply a road that we don't want to go down, because this right is so fundamental and should not be touched. Secondly, this is a point that I've already talked about a lot, is the importance of freedom of speech for a democratic, pluralistic society. Now, I use this quote at the beginning from the US because this is country where this is a very, very important right. And it is simply the basis of a democracy. Democracies were founded because everybody, has the right to voice their opinion. Now, if somebody gets up in this room and says something horrible that's completely nasty, we have a lot of people that will stand up and disprove this person. And only because this person was allowed to stand up and say this, we actually started a discussion, we started talking about things, and we just didn't sweep them under the table and pretend that it doesn't exist. Now, if we do not have this big discussion about what we are allowed, what good things are and what bad things are, we have the further consequence that people are marginalized, which is something, again, that my second speaker will elaborate on, because it also shows how their policy and their idea worsens the situation that we have. Now, we do believe in these fundamental rights. We believe that freedom of speech is something that cannot be impeded on for the individual, because this individual right stands above all and should not be touched. And secondly, because a democratic, open society should be able to deal and will be able to deal with this problem. Now, coming back to my summary, today I've showed you that their policy is not legitimate due to the freedom of speech which stands over this, and that theirs was actually not an effective way of doing this, even if this was the case. And for all these reasons, ladies and gentlemen, this motion must fall today.
Last year, a leading light in the Pakistani feminist movement collapsed. She spent 3 days living in a coma before finally waking up. The reason why was that the hate speech which she suffered on social media was so bad that she felt threatened for her life, her family's life, and her very worth as a human being, to such a point that she could no longer stand to be awake. This is the life we live on a social media that continues to allow without punishment hate speech and call it free speech. What I'm going to be doing in today's round is 3 things. Firstly, I'm going to offer a little bit of rebuttal on what we just heard from the opposition. Secondly, I'm going to work to extend what Millen told you in the first proposition. And lastly, I'm going to introduce the third substantive argument given to you by the proposition, that we end up seeing a decrease in undesired hate speech that's unintentional. But before we do that, let's look at the framing of the motion so that we can establish a little bit of common ground, because it gets a little bit muddy when the last speaker stands up and talks to you. She says it's good that we've established this as a value motion. That's exactly what they think as well. But then she goes on throughout the entire speech to call what we're saying a policy. That's false. What we tell you very clearly is that instead we need to look at this as a decision between human beings. Do we, as human beings, recognize the simple fact that we ought to be taking action against hate speech, that we ought not value hate speech? If the answer is yes, then you vote for the proposition. Moving on, we look towards the first point that we get from side opposition, and that's that there's the individual freedoms that are limited. And this is where they want to weigh the freedom of an individual to speak out with hatred against the freedom of marginalized groups, victims of hate speech. And we're very comfortable with that weight, to be honest, because here we have the freedom not just to speak out. They illustrated very well that someone is still allowed to speak out under the system. We can't possibly ban hate speech outright. But what we can do is punish it and recognize it as wrong under this value.
Sir?
We can say that it is false, and then we can ban these. That's not a policy, that's the value which we're putting forth. Now, we recognize that it's imperfect, but we think it is the action that is so important. This is what we must do in this instance. This is where we value it. Moreover, they're saying that we ought to value the freedoms of these people, just to make a couple of statements and not lose access to their accounts for a little bit, over the values of people like this leading light in feminism to continue living comfortably, or like Amanda Todd to continue living her life, or like the millions of minorities living in oppressed situations to consider being in society. That's what we value in today's round, but you're giving the individuals the top priority.
Well, we are looking at a motion where the word is ban people from social media, and you're not looking at any of the implications that it has. You're just saying hate speech is bad, which is something that we agree with.
Sure. You say hate speech is bad. Wonderful. But you don't give us any way to recognize that fact. Just saying hate speech is bad is not enough when we have other actions which demonstrate that it is wrong. That's what we value in today's round. The second thing that we hear is that democracy will somehow prove a dialogue that's going to make things better. They say that whenever we live in democratic societies, we're going to be able to produce a dialogue that's contrary to this, and that this only occurs with free speech. What we tell you is, first of all, we're all coming out of democratic societies in this debate, and we still live with these horrible instances of hate speech. Why? Because the dialogue is not enough. Because minority groups are marginalized.
Point, sir.
Because they fear death over dialogue. Whenever they're online, they come to recognize the fact that they are risking their lives, that they are risking their well-being. Why? Because they suffer from this hate speech. Hate has real-world implications. That is everything that Millen tells you in his first speech, that people suffer as a result. And that marginalizes people. What they say, their highest amount of ability to counter this, is that, well, we marginalize people who have hate speech. And when we're asked to weigh which one do we value more, the speech from minorities have been historically oppressed, or the speech from people who are the oppressors, we think it's very easy to say, and they would probably agree since they just said that they don't like hate speech, that we should be valuing these minorities more. That's the question of the value speech. Now,
Sir?
what have we heard from the proposition? To extend a little bit on what Millen tells you, we firstly said that there are significant harms to the people who suffer at the hands of this hate speech. We tell you that they are at increased risks of being bullied. We tell you that 1/3 of them being bullied online are likely to commit suicide. That is a tangible, real-world harms. And so even if you buy all of their analysis about how we're not looking at the real-world harms, we give you that right there. But furthermore, what we tell you is that's the result. What we do when we limit the freedom of speech here on side opposition is we end up allowing living the freedom to life on the side of the proposition. What they're telling you is that we should allow people to speak freely despite the fact that we limit the right to life on the part of the people who are oppressed by hate speech. The second thing we tell you is that we're silencing minorities through this, because people fear speaking out online. Millen tells you that Twitter is more subjugating in the real world, because people fear a Twitter where they're 80% more likely to be bullied online. We live in a more segregated society because we continue not to value the freedom of speech in terms of allowing people to recognize speech equally, rather than valuing the freedom of speech which just allows hate speech to continue oppressing minorities. That's our problem. Now we're going to move on into the third substantive argument, because we've shown you effectively why we're valuing the rights to those who are victims more. And we've shown you how we can actually affect change on the side of the proposition. We're going to talk about how this limits the unintended consequences of hate speech. Because the sad reality is that despite the fact that many of us don't want to give hate speech, there's an astonishing amount of hate speech in the world. And oftentimes the people who are giving it don't realize that what they're saying is hate speech. The fact of the matter is, we cannot divorce ourselves from our social standing. We cannot allow ourselves to be removed from the point of privilege at which we live. And so when that occurs, we don't really understand what we're saying and how it may harm other people. So, I'll take you in a moment, when I, as a privileged white male, say something, I might not understand the implications of it, but you say all is equal.
If we just sweep all those feelings under the rug, how are we ever going to be able to cope with it?
False. We are not sweeping them under the rug. We are punishing them, calling them out for the first time has been done. That is the key stance given to you by the proposition of this round. That by showing that they're wrong, we end up causing problems towards their very values. We move on a little further in this analysis, because we don't understand some of these problems. It means that we are often quick to recognize once we're told that it's wrong. So if I say something hateful on the internet, and turn out getting banned online, I'm forced to come to terms with what I said. And if it was a mistake, I can recognize and learn from the fact that I did something wrong. So for example, when Harvard University faced protests because of the use of the term housemasters in their institutional system, they were able to quickly change. They didn't want to use hate speech, but they did so by accident, and when it was brought to their attention by protests by black students, what ended up happening is they changed rapidly. That is the world we live in which we consistently demonstrate our value of these minority voices over the voices of people who use it for hate speech. That's why I've never been prouder to propose. Thank you.
My proposition
Proposition came up here was something that I am absolutely deeply shocked by. They came up here in the second speech and said, if you stand against hate speech, then you have to stand for the side proposition. And we on side opposition do absolutely not stand for hate speech. I don't think there is a person in this world who or at least in the debating society, who stands for hate speech. We also said that in our first speech, that we recognize the problem of hate speech on social media, but that we do not see that the value or the policy that side proposition is proposing is the most effective way to see this. So I am deeply offended by this accusation of side proposition and hope that they listen more carefully to what we are actually saying. Now I'm going to start out with some rebuttal against this proposition, and then move on to my own argument about the detrimental consequences that this debate would, that this motion would have. So first of all, side proposition is giving you like a very teary analysis of extreme cases that happened due to hate speech. Like the woman who fell into a 3-day coma because she was so afraid for her life and for the life of her family. And see if this is like extremely like not the usual hate speech and very radical. We also see that hate speech is very nuanced, as Yoka told you, and that you also have to consider the smaller cases where somebody says, "Go insert swear word to yourself, no thank you," or please don't come back to school like nobody likes you. So they also have to deal with those kinds of things. And we agree that it's really sad, for example, Amanda Todd, that she killed herself due to the bullying because a sex predator spread her images online. But we also see that this banning these people would not be the best alternative. We have other alternatives which are a lot more effective. For example, they said that in the United States they have a free democracy and they see these horrible instances. We in Germany also have a free democracy, but we do not see these instances because we have alternatives, such as comment filtering and post filtering, whereby using software, certain keywords and certain like slogans and images can be filtered out of social media, and that is why the swastika example, which they gave in their first speech, that is why it applies to our side, because we see that in Germany this kind of thing is not allowed, not because the people are banned, but because these alternatives are used by which posts are filtered. And so we see that they have to prove us how this is the only and most effective measure for how to combat hate speech, and they have not managed to do so far. Then they moreover talked about like how we can't ban hate speech, but we can recognize the problem. And what we say is that you have to ban, per definition of the motion, you have to ban these people because that's what losing access means.
Yeah.
And moreover, we see that you're not actually looking at the consequences. You're saying, oh, this is a value debate, but you still have to look at the consequences of what would happen if you implement this motion. The only thing that you are saying is that this is hate speech on social media and it's bad. But it stops there. There is no further analysis. No, thank you. Then moreover, they talked about like this harming minorities, right? So we have two responses to this. First of all, this is just sweeping the underlying problems such as racism, sexism, transphobia, those kind of things under the carpet and hoping that they will magically solve themselves and disappear. That is not how it's going to happen. It's not just going to disappear. Instead, we see that these people, when they lose access, they no longer have any opposition by any other people, as Yoka explained, by any other people on this social media who counterbalanced their opinions, and thus their opinion would merely fester and grow as they have no intelligent discoursive discussion. Moreover, they asked if we should just allow slurs that offend to protect the freedom of speech and the point of information. And I just want to reiterate this. We obviously don't approve of hate speech, but there are more effective measures to deal with this, such as the comment filtering. And these alternatives, no thank you, are better because they don't isolate those who preach hate speech, and thus and this is something I'm going to talk about in just a minute. 1 second, please. The last idea about how people commit suicide more due to online bullying is something I will also address in my own substantive. Yes.
In countries like the United States and other worlds, we have filters on the internet now. Wouldn't the fact that we have actions taken to actually stop hate speech imply that we should do something to actually, have those people lose their accounts? Doesn't that argument actually go for our side of the house?
What we see is that these filters then, if you have them in the United States as well and have these incidents, are obviously not good enough. Yes. That's why we need to improve these things and improve the software that exists. We don't have to ban these people because there's so many detrimental consequences, which I will be talking about right now. So we see that other alternatives which we can improve and invest our time and money in these kinds of alternatives are much more effective. So first of all, my substantive. So how would this policy actually worsen the situation? I'm going to analyze this on 2 levels. First of all, by gathering all the hate speech preachers together, and second of all, about more hate speech and hate actions in real life. So first of all, by banning all people from social media who have the similar views and who have expressed them, as they will lose access, they will be angered and frustrated because they can't even express their views on social media. Now this doesn't sound so bad, having a bunch of frustrated, mean people. However, this actually is very bad because they are isolated and ostracized from social media, and they will find a way to connect via a different manner. This means that they won't only express their views as a community, but they would also have this new discontent about the way they're treated, which would result in more anger, more hatred, and more extreme views.
Yeah.
And especially since there is no opposition to their views anymore, as seeing as they have lost access to this open discourse that, as York was told, they would. This actually leads to a more detrimental consequence because they are unimposed and they can nurture their ideology. Now, second of all, this idea about more hate speech and more hate actions in real life. This also directly targets the argument that they gave about people committing suicide online due to bullying. So first of all, this idea about committing suicide online due to bullying, this also happened before social media existed. People were bullied in real life and committed suicide, and we see that this will actually just revert back, and this is what I'm going to talk about now. So because they've been isolated and have no manner to express their views online anymore, they will be able to express it publicly and personally because they've been so convinced by their ideology that they simply have to express it. I mean, they've been repeated offenders. By expressing their view in real life, it's worse because the affected party that they are targeting cannot escape this hate speech as they could on the internet. They could switch off their computer, take a breath, go to their friends, something like that. But if they are targeted in real life, the bullying is much more personal, especially because in the majority of cases, this hate speech will originate from someone who you know, so it targets one and cuts deeper. Then, moreover, we see that hate speech in real life can actually quickly turn to hateful actions, unlike on social media. On social media, there's a physical limitation which is stopping you. You cannot physically reach through the screen and punch someone in the face. However, in real life, when you have this hate speech, you can actually act on this hate speech and become more violent and express your opinion on a violent manner. So we actually see that this poly has extremely detrimental consequences, both for in terms of festering the ideas and no longer allowing for an opposition to this idea, which is also what Yoga talked about, but also because it allows for more hate speech in real life, thus not combating the actual issue of hate speech, such as the sexism and transphobia and things like that, but moreover, it can lead to harmful and aggressive actions. So what have I told you today? I've talked to you about how talked to you about the detrimental consequences and showed you how the side proposition has to prove that this is the only and most effective measure to combat hate speech. Whereas we have showed you that there are other alternatives which actually work and that if we need to, we should just improve them. So ladies and gentlemen, because I may not agree with what you're saying, but I will die for your right to say it, please vote opposition. Thank you.
Jada is a black high school student who was raped and drugged at a party. Photos were then taken of her afterwards, spread through social media, where people condemned her actions, saying because she was a woman, she deserved it. Because she was black, she deserved it. We believe it is ethically imperative to consider the harms of what has happened in these instances that are not just isolated, but are a systemic trend throughout society. Team opposition would say, I may not agree with who you are, Jada, but you should die, suffer, and be punished for my right to say it. Because of that, we believe that you should propose today's motion. In this speech, I'm going to be doing a couple of things. First, some procedural analysis on the idea of the value and the framing that team proposition initially sets up at the top of the case. Next, I'm going to go on to posing 2 questions you should ask yourself when evaluating this round. First, is free speech hate speech, and what type of speech should people lose their accounts for? And second, does the individual rights of one troll outweigh the greater societal benefit of having the proposition's motion? But first, some procedural analysis just to clear things up. We are weighing the value of losing your account for hate speech against the value of not losing your account because of hate speech. We think that hate speech is so bad right now in the status quo that you ought to have a ban on the losing of the accounts of those individuals who perpetuate it. They say, their only response to this and the framing out of team proposition, they say that having individuals lose their accounts is not going to solve the problem, it is not going to eliminate hate speech, therefore we should not do that. No. We say that there is still good that comes out of the idea of having people lose their accounts, and that the value of that is supported. They come up here in their last speech and say that the burden of team proposition is somehow to prove that the only way to stop hate speech is through people losing their accounts, but we say this is not the burden they bring up in their first speech. We tell you that the burden of team proposition is to prove that the hate speech that is currently in the status quo affecting these individuals is bad enough to warrant having people lose their accounts for that hate speech. That is the distinction between the framing set up with team proposition, and team opposition is just misconstruction of what that was down the bench. So, on to 2 questions you should ask yourself now that we've cleared that up. First, is free speech hate speech? Here's the short answer, no. Here's the long answer. You are allowed to say, I dislike X policy the government implemented, but you are not allowed to say that women should be targeted. Who agrees with me? Those are 2 very distinct things. The argument that they give you is that somehow this is going to create some sort of snowball effect, because people should be allowed to get on the internet and say they want to start a race war, and people should be allowed to get on the internet and try and get people to join them, because we have to give an outlet for these people to voice their opinions. We say that the idea of this snowball effect, that somehow saying that, hey, you saying a racially charged comment is bad, is not going to lead to censoring thought throughout the country. We just reject that idea. We think that's extreme. They also say that the idea of nuanced comments are all that we're looking at, but here's what we tell you. We tell you that what kind of speech you ought to ban falls under the definition that Millen clearly sets up for you in his first speech. He tells you that when this speech is aimed to oppress, demonize, hurt, and silence people, then it falls under the category of hate speech. We tell you that this is not just nuanced, individual, isolated instances, rather a systemic pattern where 80% of teenagers say it is easier to use hate speech online because of the depersonalized aspect that social media provides. Point?
But for example, if somebody posts a picture of 2 gay people, wouldn't this severely actually offend some people with very extreme religious thoughts? And wouldn't they think that this actually severely damages and offends their religious thoughts?
That's interesting, but irrelevant in the today's debate. We tell you that the idea of religious freedom, versus a picture of 2 people holding hands and on the internet, has absolutely nothing to do with people going out and trying to target historically marginalized groups with the intent of oppressing them. Those 2 are not analogous in any way, shape, or form. They also talk about this idea of Germany has a filter on what is considered hate speech and what is considered free speech. We tell you that the filter also exists in other countries like the United States, like the UK, but this problem is not bad enough. This is what interacts with the idea of this absurd burden that just somehow originates in the last speech of trying to prove that the losing of social media accounts is the only way. If their filter was doing a good enough job already, we would not have we would not need to have the implication of people to lose their accounts. There's a fundamental contradiction coming out of team opposition when they say that team proposition doesn't actually punish people in their world. However, but then they turn around and tell you that what we are trying to advocate for in our framing is actually not going to solve the problem. This is fundamentally contradictory, and we're not really sure where team opposition stands on this. So, is free speech hate speech? No. That's what we tell you. Second question, does the right of one individual person to spew their hate on the internet outweigh the greater societal impact of preserving the marketplace of ideas and bringing historically marginalized people into the conversation? Here's what we tell you. We say that when you make questions about open discourse online, the real question you have to ask yourself initially is open for who? Team opposition assumes that right now historically marginalized people are not being targeted, and that it's just free reign for them to engage in these conversations, and that we're going to have an equal playing field, that if someone who is trying to, quote, start a race war is going to want to sit down and have an equal conversation with a historically marginalized person. We tell you this is a fundamentally wrong assumption. They literally say that we need the voices of racism and sexism and Islamophobia in society in order for people to have discussions. But we say if historically these voices have been shutting the other individuals out, that does not give them free rein to just incorporate them into society. We say that safe speech online is not a privilege that should just be given to trolls with the loudest voices, but rather a right that should be afforded to everyone. If hate speech is a hindrance on the ability for individuals to incorporate into society and to actually increase their views in pluralism on the internet, then you ought to have those people lose their accounts. But you would disagree.
If you believe some groups are marginalized and can voice their opinions, aren't you just shifting that marginalization to other groups, and you have basically the same effect?
Are you saying that we should, that marginalizing people who think racism is good is a bad thing? I think that's what you just said. I'm sorry if someone who thinks that, going up there and saying racist or sexist comments, we should not defend their right to target individuals and actually, rally support to take actions. The fact of the matter is, the hate speech that we see online translates out into the real world. The idea that 33% of children who are victims of hate speech online commit suicide is reason enough to just reject team opposition on face value. So at the end of the debate, what do you have? We tell you that if the harms in society right now, the implications, very tangible problems of hate speech, are bad enough to warrant people losing their accounts, you propose today's motion. Here's what we say, that the rights of one individual person to spew hate does not outweigh the greater societal impact of preserving the marketplace of ideas as an inclusive space for unfettered speech and thus protecting individual rights. We reject the fact that team opposition wants to champion for the rights of people who have always silenced other individuals, and because of that, I beg you to propose.
Ladies and gentlemen, because we believe that democracy is about more than just hearing what you like to hear, but also about hearing what you do not like to hear, about hearing the uncomfortable, and therefore we are so proud to oppose. So in this debate, said proposition has basically been trying to prove to us that hate speech is bad and telling us that they do not like hate speech. Well, we agree that we do not like hate speech. What they would have to do is establish the link to freedom of speech. Why we limit freedom of speech in this case. And we said in our arguments, we outlined why it was so important for democracy. Yoka told you it was never clashed. We also outlined why it would be even worse if we in fact restricted this speech. In Louisa's speech, this was again never clashed by side opposition. All this analysis still stand and will still stand by the end of the debate. Because we've shown all that, I'm so proud to oppose. So what are the main clashes of this debate? First, I'm going to look at harms to individuals. Then I'm going to look at this idea of democracy and free speech and hate speech. And then I'm going to look at this idea of the free marketplace of ideas and harms to society. Right, now first on to the harm to the individual. So first of all, we point out that this is not the majority of cases. This is not what this debate is just about. Why? Because Josh, in fact, tells us, well, we have no other punishment. In fact, we do have other punishment. If somebody offends you online, if somebody insults you online, you can still go and sue that person. And you can still do something against it, right? It's not as if you wouldn't be able to defend yourself against that at all. Moreover, we tell you that this motion will not at all change the issue. It will just switch the issue, right? Because if we just shut down their accounts, they will create new accounts and continue to offend those individuals on those new accounts. So we don't see that makes a difference. If they and some will also, as Louisa told you in her analysis, switch that hate speech to real life, where we see that it is much, much worse, as she told you, never answered at all by said proposition at all. So we see that this is extremely harmful. No, thank you. So now on to the second class, which is really the most important one. What does free speech mean for democracy? Because, ladies and gentlemen, in our postmodern world, we often have this conception of packing everybody in bubble wrap, of shielding us from the views we would not like to hear, of shielding us from what we do not appreciate, like said proposition would want to do us. However, this is not what democracy is about. Democracy is about all opinions, not just the ones that we like. And this is why it's so important that what Yoke brings you and I bring in our PRI about gay rights. Because, ladies and gentlemen, we say that free speech, they define it as something that offends people. Obviously, there's very different things that offend very different people. So for extremely religious people, seeing a gay parade is might be just as offensive as it is for Muslims to hear derogatory comments made about them. So this is why we also allow gay rights parades to march through the most conservative, most gay-hating districts, and this is why this is so important. Right.
Here's the difference. When conservative people who don't like gays see that, they get a little irritated. But when people on Twitter actually say these things about Muslims, they get killed in real life.
people who do not like gay rights are not just irritated. Many of them are enraged, right? Many of them attack gay rights groups. Many of them attack, for example, abortion clinics, and we still do so. The purpose of democracy is to represent all opinions, not just the ones we happen to like right now at this moment. No. Moreover, they tell us about we get rid of oppression of the groups. Well, we say that this oppression has been in society for thousands of years. It's not just going to go away just because we don't allow people to post about it online. Moreover, we say that this is just it's also bad to oppress the offenders, right? They say we don't want to we don't want to have any opinion silenced, right? We actually do not want to have any opinion silenced because we do not want to silence this opinion. In a democracy, sometimes you do not have this right, like not to be offended personally. You do have to be you should be able to cope with this kind of stuff because it's necessary for this democracy to work and to represent everybody. No, thank you. Now, on to this third idea of harm to society and like societal groups. So they tell us that other people. So first of all, they tell us that like some people do not feel marginalized and won't be able to voice their freedom of speech. We say that of course this is horrible, but however they do not change that at all because what they do is just silence other people. Right? They say, oh, we like this opinion more, so we will not listen. We will only listen to this opinion. Right? We say that's in fact no different to their argumentation. Right? And moreover, we tell you that this is not getting better with what they do, which we talk about in Louisa's speech, which they again fail to address. Will be too late to address. No, we just sweep all those opinions under the carpet. What does that mean? Those opinions will still exist. They will not just cease to exist, unlike they believe, because we don't allow it on social media. No, thank you. Those people will feel ostracized by society. Those people will just be amongst themselves, where we have no ability to have this free marketplace of ideas. No, thank you. No ability to critique them, for example, by commenting below their Facebook posts. In their second speech, we get this really strange idea. Well, some people who accidentally do hate speech will feel changed. First of all, we just don't understand why this. If you're just banned from a website, there's no reason why you would change, because if it says you're banned from this website, you don't know why you were banned. It's not like telling you just said this and this is bad because of all those reasons, and so we don't see why this affects those people at all. Moreover, we say that this is just a backlash against those people, and those people will backlash against this because they feel harmed by this. No, thank you. So what are the most important values in this debate? We talked about democracy, and how in a democracy it is necessary to live with what you do not like. In a democracy it's necessary to live not only with what you want to hear, but also with what you need to hear. And we say that hate speech in many cases is something you need to hear, because we need to represent every opinion accurately, because we need a pluralistic society. We think that it's necessary for democracy. Moreover, on this entire part about individuals, right, there are still methods to do so under our model. You can still sue the offender if he just insults you. And also, right, this is not the crux of the debate. The crux of the debate is democracy. And because we believe that every opinion should be represented, no opinion, in fact, should be marginalized, because we may not like what you have to say, but we will die for your right to say it. We are so proud to stand up here, defend the values of democracy, and oppose.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back one last time to this debate from Team Opposition. Now, in this debate, we had two main clashes. First of all, the freedom of speech clash, and secondly, the policy clash. So, start out with the freedom of speech. All Team Proposition did today was show us that there is hate speech on social media and that this is a bad thing, and that is something that shouldn't exist. They said that we said we're basically for hate speech, which is definitely not the point of the motion today, and which is definitely not what we showed today. However, what Team Proposition failed to do was actually finish the link that ties how all these bad things legitimize limiting free speech. They simply painted a very tearful, very one-dimensional picture of the situation. However, they failed to continue to say how this legitimizes limiting speech, which is free speech, which is exactly what they were proposing in this debate. Now, on the other hand, Team Opposition did this in several ways. They showed that limiting freedom of speech is illegitimate because of two main things. First of all, if we look at the individual rights, the individual human basic right of freedom of speech. This is an untouchable right, and starting to limit free speech, we said, is not a road that we want to go down. Secondly, we showed you how freedom of speech is absolutely necessary and is not something that should be limited in a democracy and in a functioning pluralistic society. We showed you that an open discussion about ideas is very important and is a fundament of a democratic society. We said that it is extremely important that bad ideas and ideas that are not good are challenged, debated, and contested and talked about and not just swept under the carpet. And we also said that a strong pluralistic society has to be able to endure some bad things that are said, because this will always happen, that the only way to deal with this is an open discussion. Thus, they did not quite manage to show how this, what is happening, legitimizes the freedom of speech, and our points were not actually sufficiently dealt with, and they did not engage with our points. Now, the next big thing that we had in this debate was this policy thing. While it is a value debate, it is still necessary when they are actually talking about the motion, which has the phrasing to lose access, so to ban people from social media, it's important to also look at the implications and the consequences of what they are proposing. Now, they simply stopped with their analysis at the point that hate speech is bad and that's something that shouldn't exist, but they stopped there. They failed to show us that this is the right way to go and that their measure would be somewhat effective. Coincidentally, this was exactly what was their burden in this debate, and this is the burden that Louisa and I gave them in our two speeches, and this was a burden that they did not contest. Team's proposition's job today was to show that hate speech has such significant effects that it legitimizes the limiting of free speech, and that their way, what they are proposing, is the best and most effective way to do this. Now, they failed to show the legitimization, and they failed to show that's the right way to do. We, on the other hand, showed that freedom of speech is an uncontestable, unlimited right that should exist, and definitely is not something that we should limit in the way that they propose. And we also showed that the way that what they are proposing to do is not the right way to go and is completely inefficient. For this reason, Team Opposition's case stands.
Hate speech is not free speech. This is the distinction we brought you across the bench on side proposition. They did not engage with us on this substantive issue. All we've heard from the opposition is that we can never limit the right of free speech. Well then, why did we tell you in the very first speech of this debate that we limit free speech all the time when it benefits the people? In the United States and the UK, you can't yell fire in a crowded building. In their country, Germany, you can't post pictures of swastikas because they're very offensive to individuals. If this is going to snowball so badly, why don't we see this effect in the world today? They never explained to us its implication. They never described to us why hate speech is actually free speech. That was their critical strategic error. Two questions in the speech. What are the harms of this ban? And secondly, how effective actually would this ban be? But firstly, an important contradiction by side opposition. They tell us firstly that they hate hate speech, that they reject that notion on side opposition. But in the very same breath, they turn around and say, people need to hear hate speech. It's what needs to be in the discourse today. What are they advocating for on side opposition? I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure everyone else in this room isn't sure either. First question in this debate, what are the harms? First thing they talk to you about is snowballing. They say if we violate the right to free speech a little bit, then it's going to snowball and we're going to have censorship. Why isn't this happening in the world today? Free speech is limited. None of these impacts actually occur. Secondly, they tell you this is going to be exacerbated if we sweep these people under the rug. We gave you a couple of responses. Firstly, these people are primarily getting more extreme when they're online. We gave you this analysis in our second point in the very first speech of this debate. We said they're thrown into echo chambers because there are no marginalized views on the internet, and that's when these opinions get more extreme. But secondly, we show them that they're incorrect when we ban their social media accounts, and that's what shows them that in the future, they shouldn't be having these discussions in person. They say no one tells them that it's wrong. We tell them it's wrong by implementing a ban. Next, they talk about the real-world implications. They say this is going to move into the real world. People are going to be offending people in the real world. But we respond to this in two ways. Firstly, we gave you the depersonalization analysis. We said people are 80% more likely to say this stuff online because you don't actually have to face a person face-to-face. They callously say this is going to happen in person, but they disregard that analysis. Secondly, we told you that these people actually organize online, so it's not easy for this to happen in person. Remember the example of Bill and Ruth. He had to organize all of these people online, all of these white supremacists through the internet, and it couldn't have happened in person without this hate speech. Next, they talked to you about the alternative. We responded to the filter, then they completely dropped it. They bring up this entirely new example in the third speech of suing people, disregarding entirely how this suing actually occurs, through what process you prove this in a court, or how common it actually is in the world today. No validity to that example. Finally, they bring up this another new example about subjectivity. They tell you that people who promote gay rights might offend people who are extremely conservative. We say there's a difference between someone promoting their own rights and actively demonizing another group like you do with Muslims. There's a fine distinction there that side opposition entirely ignores. Let's go on to the benefits of the ban. This is very simple. They say our burden is to prove that the ban is the absolute best thing for this issue. That was never our burden in this round. We contested this across the bench. All that we have to prove is that the benefits of the ban outweigh the detriments to free speech, and that's exactly what we did. They only tried to point out how the ban isn't perfect, but that's just defensive. It's not offensive on why the ban is actually bad. They said that people can make new accounts. So what? The majority of people aren't going to. They never said how prevalent this is going to be. They disregard people dying. We tell you the link between having a ban and stopping people from stopping hate speech from harming people is that this hate speech happens on social media. We eliminate this speech from social media, or at least reduce it by implementing a ban. So the 33% of kids who are bullied won't commit suicide. So the people who are 80% more likely to bully online won't be able to bully online. So the people who have been marginalized groups historically online will actually be able to access the internet, access the greatest free marketplace of ideas in the world today. They never actually engage with our analysis. All they do is try to poke holes in it. They failed to do that. Because they never told you why hate speech is actually free speech. We are honored to propose, and we beg you to do the same.